Our home on Maple Street had been in the family for 3 generations. My grandfather purchased the property when the neighborhood was nothing more than a collection of modest houses surrounded by open fields. Over the decades, he watched as those fields transformed into cul-de-sacs and shopping centers, but our quarter-acre lot remained largely unchanged, a testament to simpler times. I moved in with Grandpa 5 years ago after finishing college. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary while I saved for my own place, but something about the quiet rhythm of life there made me stay. Our routines fit together seamlessly. I worked remotely as a graphic designer while Grandpa spent his days in the garage workshop, his second home since retiring from a 40-year career as an electrical engineer for the power company. Grandpa kept the property immaculate. The lawn was always perfectly trimmed, the garden beds meticulously maintained, and the white fence freshly painted each spring. His workshop, though cluttered with tools and components, followed a system of organization that only he fully understood. Watching him work was like observing a conductor leading an orchestra, every movement deliberate, every decision calculated. Our neighbors appreciated his attention to detail. Mrs. Winters next door often remarked that our yard kept property values up for the whole street. The Garcias across the way would bring over homemade empanadas in exchange for Grandpa fixing their appliances. Even Mr. Peterson, notorious for complaining about everything from mail delivery times to bird songs, nodded approvingly when passing our house on his daily walks. The neighborhood operated on unspoken rules of mutual respect. People maintained their properties, helped one another, and resolved disputes directly. That changed last spring when Oak Ridge developers purchased several vacant lots at the end of our street and constructed a dozen cookie-cutter homes. Suddenly, flyers appeared in our mailboxes announcing the formation of a homeowners association. Most residents signed the agreement reluctantly. The promised benefits seemed reasonable: maintained common areas, seasonal decorations, a neighborhood watch program. Grandpa read the paperwork thoroughly before signing, noting that the majority of board positions would initially be filled by Oak Ridge representatives, with resident elections scheduled for the following year. It might not be so bad, I told him as we reviewed the covenant together at the kitchen table. Maybe it will keep things nice around here. Grandpa adjusted his reading glasses and shrugged. Maybe so. But remember, people who seek control seldom stop once they get a taste for it. The first warning letter arrived 3 weeks after the HOA officially formed. The envelope was crisp white with an embossed logo in the corner. Inside, a formal notice cited unauthorized lawn ornaments in clear violation of aesthetic guidelines. The object in question was a small stone garden gnome that had sat beneath our oak tree for decades, a gift from my grandmother before she passed. "This has to be a mistake," I said, showing Grandpa the letter. The guidelines said nothing about garden decorations under 12 inches. Grandpa read the notice silently, his weathered fingers tracing each line of text. "It will blow over," he said finally. "Someone is just being overzealous." That evening, while watering the tomato plants, I noticed movement at the back of our property. The setting sun cast long shadows across the yard, but I could clearly make out a figure standing on something, peering over our 6-foot privacy fence. A man in a dark uniform with a clipboard. When our eyes met, he quickly disappeared from view. The encounter lasted only seconds, but it left me with an uneasy feeling that clung to me as I went inside. Something told me this was just the beginning. The next morning I rushed through the back door, still in my pajamas and robe. "There is someone in our yard," I called to Grandpa, who was at the kitchen table with his coffee and crossword puzzle. Outside, the man stood with practiced authority beside our shed, snapping photos of the small vegetable garden. His uniform was navy blue with an embroidered patch reading Community Standards Enforcement. When he saw me approaching, he lowered his camera. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is private property. How did you get in here?" The man gestured vaguely toward the back fence. "Routine inspection. We received complaints about potential violations." "You climbed our fence without permission." My voice rose despite my efforts to remain calm. He straightened his posture, attempting to appear taller. "As a community standards officer, I have authorization to investigate reported violations." "Not by trespassing," I countered. His expression hardened. "I would recommend addressing the unsanctioned vegetable garden and unapproved shed color before formal citations become necessary." Without waiting for a response, he walked briskly toward the gate, clipboard tucked firmly under his arm. I stood speechless, watching him leave. When I returned inside, Grandpa had risen from his chair, concern etched on his face. "What happened?" "He climbed our fence to inspect the yard. Said something about our garden and shed violating rules." The next day brought another official notice, this one in a yellow envelope marked violation. The letter detailed 3 infractions: an unapproved garden structure, our tomato trellis, excessive vegetation, the vegetable garden that exceeded permitted dimensions by 8 inches, an unauthorized exterior color, the shed, painted the same blue it had been for 20 years. Grandpa and I sat at the kitchen table, the offensive letter between us. "This makes no sense," I said. "Half the houses on the street have vegetable gardens larger than ours." "The issue is not the garden," Grandpa replied, his voice thoughtful. "The issue is that we are being singled out." That evening, Grandpa retrieved the HOA bylaws from his filing cabinet, spreading the papers across the dining room table. He put on his reading glasses and began methodically highlighting sections, making notes in the margins. I watched as he flipped between pages, cross-referencing items with careful precision. "It says here that inspections must be conducted from public access points or with 24 hours written notice," he said, tapping a highlighted paragraph. "No mention of authorization to enter private property without consent." 2 days later, I attended the monthly HOA meeting at the community center. The sterile room was half filled with residents, most looking as uncomfortable as I felt. 5 people sat at a long table facing the audience, 4 men in suits I recognized as Oak Ridge representatives, and a woman with immaculately styled blonde hair and a permanent smile that never reached her eyes. When the floor opened for comments, I raised my hand and was acknowledged with obvious reluctance. "I want to address the issue of HOA officers entering private property without permission," I began, describing the incident in our backyard. The woman at the center of the table, introduced earlier as Ms. Harriet Donovan, HOA manager, cut me off mid-sentence. "Oak Ridge community guidelines clearly outline inspection protocols. Our enforcement officer has full authority to ensure compliance throughout the neighborhood. But climbing over fences without permission seems like trespassing," I persisted. One of the Oak Ridge representatives leaned forward. "Perhaps you misunderstood. Visual inspections are necessary to maintain community standards. If residents have nothing to hide, they should welcome these quality assurance measures." Several board members exchanged knowing glances. Ms. Donovan's smile tightened. "We have contracted Excellence Property Management to handle enforcement. Their officers are trained professionals who understand property law. Now, moving on to our next agenda item." The dismissal was clear. As the meeting continued, I noticed other residents shifting uncomfortably in their seats, a few exchanging worried looks. No one else spoke up. When I arrived home, Grandpa was in his workshop, the light visible under the door. I decided not to disturb him with the disappointing news. Later that night, I noticed his desk lamp still on, illuminating scattered papers covered in his neat engineering handwriting. Among them lay printed pages about property law and a book titled Understanding Your Legal Rights as a Homeowner. He was planning something, and knowing Grandpa, it would be methodical, thorough, and completely unexpected. The yellow envelopes began appearing in our mailbox with alarming regularity. Each contained new and increasingly absurd violations. A bird feeder mounted 2 inches higher than regulation, wind chimes exceeding the permissible number of tubes, a garden hose not properly coiled when not in use. The citations always came with fines, beginning at $50 and quickly escalating to hundreds for repeat offenses. Our security cameras, which Grandpa had installed years ago as a precaution, now served a new purpose. Every morning, we reviewed the footage, counting how many times the patrol officer circled our property. He developed a pattern, arriving first thing in the morning and again in late afternoon, sometimes spending upwards of 20 minutes examining our house from every possible angle. "This is harassment," I said one evening, watching the recorded footage of the officer measuring the height of our mailbox with a tape measure. "No one else gets this kind of scrutiny." Grandpa nodded quietly, his expression unreadable. The fines were becoming a financial burden. I had started keeping a spreadsheet of the violations and their costs, which now totaled over $2,000 in just 6 weeks. Each time we addressed one issue, 3 more would be discovered. The stress began affecting my work. I missed deadlines, apologized to clients, and found myself constantly distracted by the sound of vehicles passing our house, wondering if it was him returning again. Grandpa maintained his calm demeanor, but I noticed he spent more time in his workshop and less tending to his beloved garden. One Wednesday afternoon, I returned home early after a client canceled our virtual meeting. As I pulled into the driveway, I spotted a familiar Navy uniform moving through our backyard. This time, the officer was not just peering over the fence. He was fully inside our property, taking close-up photographs of our back porch. I parked hastily and rushed around the side of the house. "What do you think you are doing?" I demanded, my voice louder than intended. The officer turned, momentarily startled but quickly regaining his composure. He was a stocky man with close-cropped hair and small eyes that seemed perpetually narrowed in judgment. "Documenting violations," he replied flatly. "You are trespassing. This is private property." He sighed with exaggerated patience, as if explaining something to a child. As I have explained before, community standards enforcement includes property inspections. "From public spaces or with advance notice," I countered, "not by entering private property without permission." He took another photograph, deliberately pointing his camera at a potted plant on our porch steps. Section 23, Paragraph B of the Community Guidelines grants enforcement officers access to all properties for compliance verification. Perhaps you should familiarize yourself with the rules you agreed to follow. "I want you to leave right now," I said, stepping toward him. The officer tucked his camera into a belt pouch and picked up his clipboard. "Interference with an official inspection will result in additional fines." He brushed past me, making a show of writing something down as he walked to the gate. That evening, I called the HOA office and filed a formal complaint about the officer entering our property without permission. The receptionist sounded bored as she took down the information, assuring me that someone would look into it. 2 days later, I received an email stating that my complaint had been reviewed and dismissed due to insufficient evidence of inappropriate conduct by enforcement personnel. The final straw came the following week. I was bringing in groceries when Mrs. Garcia from across the street hurried over, her expression concerned. She looked around nervously before speaking. "I overheard something at the coffee shop yesterday," she said quietly. "Harriet Donovan was there with one of the Oak Ridge men. They were talking about your grandfather." My stomach tightened. "What about him?" "They mentioned that your property is on some kind of target list. Something about holdouts who refuse to sell." She touched my arm gently. "They said your grandfather turned down their offer 3 years ago when they first started buying up properties, and now they are determined to make him regret it." That night, I shared this information with Grandpa as we watched from the living room window. The patrol officer was making his evening round, flashlight beam sweeping across our front yard. For the first time, I saw anger flash across Grandpa's usually serene face. "So that is what this is about," he said quietly. "They could not buy me out, so now they try to drive us out." His eyes narrowed as he watched the beam of light pause on our fence. "They picked the wrong engineer to intimidate." In that moment, I saw a determination in my grandfather that I had not witnessed since my grandmother passed away. The resigned acceptance was gone, replaced by something steely and resolved. For 3 consecutive nights, the light in Grandpa's workshop remained on until well past midnight. The sound of drawers opening and closing, the metallic clink of tools being arranged and rearranged, the occasional scrape of his chair across the concrete floor, all indicated he was deep into a project. Whenever I asked what he was working on, his answer was the same: just tinkering with some ideas. On the 4th morning, curiosity got the better of me. While Grandpa was in the shower, I slipped into his workshop. The usually cluttered space had transformed into an organized command center. His workbench held neatly arranged electrical components, capacitors, resistors, spools of insulated wire, and several control boxes I did not recognize. The wall above was covered with diagrams, printouts of electrical schematics, and, most surprising, highlighted pages from legal textbooks. I leaned closer to examine one of the documents. It was a state statute regarding property boundaries and trespassing laws, with key sections marked in yellow. Next to it hung printouts of HOA bylaws with contradicting sections circled in red. Another page detailed legal precedents regarding homeowners' rights to secure their properties against unauthorized entry. A stack of engineering manuals sat on a side table, bookmarked to sections about low-voltage electrical systems. One diagram showed what looked like our backyard fence with dotted lines running along its perimeter. The word "circuit" was written across the top in Grandpa's precise handwriting. "Find what you were looking for." Grandpa's voice startled me. He stood in the doorway, hair still damp from his shower, looking more amused than upset at my intrusion. "I was worried about you," I admitted. "What is all this?" Grandpa closed the door behind him and gestured for me to sit. He pulled up his own stool and folded his hands on his knee. "I have been researching our options." For the next hour, Grandpa walked me through his findings. He had spent weeks studying property law, electrical code requirements, and security system regulations. The conclusion of his research was both simple and elegant. While HOA rules could dictate aesthetic standards, they could not override a homeowner's legal right to secure their property against trespassers. "Here is what I propose," he said, unrolling a detailed blueprint across the workbench. "An electronic security fence, similar to what farmers use for livestock but modified for our specific needs." The design showed our existing wooden fence fitted with a concealed wire system running along the top edge. The current is low voltage, painful enough to discourage climbing but not dangerous enough to cause lasting harm, he explained. Similar to static electricity, but more focused. I studied the schematic, impressed by its thoroughness but concerned about potential consequences. Is this legal? What if someone gets hurt? That is why I did this first, Grandpa replied, pointing to a 3-ring binder filled with legal documentation. The system operates well within safety parameters established by electrical code. More importantly, we will post clear warning signs at regular intervals. Anyone who chooses to climb the fence after seeing those warnings does so at their own risk. Still uncertain, I asked, what about the HOA? You know they will find some rule against this. Grandpa smiled slightly. I have already confirmed with a security company that homeowners' rights to protect against intruders supersede HOA aesthetic regulations. But to be absolutely certain. The next day we met with Marcus Chen, a lawyer friend of Grandpa's from his days at the power company. Marcus reviewed Grandpa's research, occasionally nodding or making notes. When he finished, he leaned back in his office chair. Theodore, he addressed my grandfather, your research is impeccable as always. Yes, you have every right to secure your property against unauthorized entry. The key factors are proper signage and ensuring the electrical current remains within safety parameters. And the HOA? I asked. Marcus adjusted his glasses. They may attempt to fight it, but legally, they stand on shaky ground. Security measures are exempt from many aesthetic restrictions, particularly when there is documented evidence of repeated trespassing. The following weekend, Grandpa and I began the installation. We worked methodically, following his detailed plans. First came the concealed wiring along the fence top, carefully insulated where it needed to be and exposed where it did not. Next, we installed the control panel in the workshop, allowing the system to be activated or deactivated remotely. Finally, we mounted warning signs at 3-foot intervals along the entire fence perimeter. Bold red text on yellow backgrounds reading, "Caution, electronic security fence, no climbing." The work was precise and demanding. Grandpa insisted on testing each section thoroughly before moving to the next. By Sunday evening, our hands were sore and our backs ached, but the system was complete. Standing in the backyard, you would hardly notice any change to the fence itself. Only the warning signs gave any indication of what lay beneath the surface. As the sun set, Grandpa activated the system for the first time. A small green light on the control panel confirmed it was working. Not exactly what I imagined for my retirement project, he said with a wry smile, but sometimes you have to adapt to changing circumstances. I looked at the innocent-looking fence, now silently electrified. Do you think it will work? Will they finally leave us alone? Grandpa's eyes twinkled with a mixture of mischief and determination. One way or another, they will learn to respect boundaries. Life settled into an uneasy routine in the days that followed. The patrol officer maintained his regular schedule, circling our property twice daily but keeping a noticeable distance from the fence since the warning signs appeared. Yellow violation envelopes continued to arrive, All the infractions now focused exclusively on front yard issues visible from the street. Grandpa resumed his gardening, spending long hours tending to his tomato plants and trimming the hedges. I attempted to catch up on work projects that had fallen behind during our fence modification efforts. We both tried to pretend we were not constantly checking the security camera feeds on our phones. Do you think he suspects anything? I asked one morning, watching the patrol officer through the kitchen window as he photographed our mailbox from the sidewalk. Grandpa sipped his coffee thoughtfully. He has noticed the signs. Whether he believes them is another matter entirely. On Thursday afternoon, exactly 10 days after we completed the installation, the moment we had been simultaneously dreading and anticipating arrived. I was working in the living room when the security app on my phone chimed with a motion alert from the backyard camera. The patrol officer had returned during his afternoon rounds. This time, instead of merely looking from a distance, he was examining our fence with unusual interest. I texted Grandpa, who was running errands. "He is back, looking at the fence." The response came immediately. "Watching now, stay inside." I connected to the live security feed and watched as the scene unfolded. The officer walked the perimeter of our property, stopping periodically to read the warning signs. His body language suggested skepticism, head tilted, hands on hips, occasionally shaking his head. After completing his circuit, he focused on a section of fence partially concealed by an oak tree, likely assuming this area would be less visible from the house. The camera caught him glancing toward our windows before removing a small step stool from his large utility belt. He positioned it against the fence and tested its stability. Then, with deliberate movements, he stepped up and reached for the top of the fence. His hand hovered momentarily over the warning sign affixed there before he gripped the wooden edge. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, yet seemed to unfold in slow motion. The officer's body suddenly went rigid. His back arched, arms splayed outward. A strangled yelp escaped his throat, not a scream of pain, but a sound of pure surprise. The connection lasted less than 2 seconds before he lost his balance and tumbled backward off the stool. Unfortunately for him, his landing spot was the freshly mulched hydrangea bed Grandpa had prepared that morning. The officer fell squarely into the soft, dark soil, sending mulch flying in all directions. His clipboard sailed through the air, papers scattering across the lawn. His official cap fell into a small decorative pond, where it floated like an absurd lily pad. For several seconds, he lay perfectly still. My heart raced as I wondered if we had miscalculated the voltage. Then, abruptly, he scrambled to his feet, brushing frantically at his now-soiled uniform. His face contorted with rage and humiliation as he looked around wildly, surely checking if anyone had witnessed his undignified fall. Apparently satisfied he was unobserved, unaware of the camera capturing every moment, he collected his scattered papers and retrieved his sodden cap from the pond. Water dripped down his face as he jammed it back onto his head. He stormed toward the gate, but paused before exiting. Turning back toward the house, he pointed an accusatory finger directly at a front window, as if he could see through walls to where I watched. The gesture was unmistakable in its promise of consequences. Grandpa returned home 20 minutes later, bringing groceries into the kitchen with unusual haste. "I saw everything on the app," he said, his voice steady but eyes alert. "How are you doing?" "Shocked, no pun intended," I admitted. "Do you think he will press charges?" "For what?" "Protecting our property against trespassers after posting clear warnings." Grandpa arranged the groceries in the refrigerator with methodical precision. "No, he will not go to the police, but the HOA." His prediction proved accurate. The next morning, a courier delivered a certified letter bearing the HOA logo. Inside was a notice for an emergency hearing scheduled for 7:00 p.m. the following evening. The language was formal but the accusation clear: dangerous modifications to property resulting in injury to community personnel. Our presence was required, not requested, with a veiled threat of immediate legal action if we failed to appear. I handed the letter to Grandpa, my hand trembling slightly. "This feels serious." He read it carefully, then placed it on the counter with remarkable calmness. "Good. Good, how is this good?" A smile spread across his weathered face, not one of amusement but of satisfaction, like a chess player who has successfully lured an opponent into a carefully planned trap. "Because now we have our forum." He disappeared into his workshop, returning moments later with a USB drive. "I have been preparing this for weeks. Everything is on here, every trespass, every harassment, every illegal entry. All time-stamped, all documented." Understanding dawned. "You wanted this to happen." Grandpa's eyes gleamed with the strategic brilliance that had made him such a successful engineer. "I wanted justice. Sometimes you have to set the stage for it properly." He pocketed the USB drive. "They think they are putting us on trial tomorrow night. They do not realize they have called their own hearing." The community center meeting room was filled beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood about the confrontation, drawing curious residents who normally avoided HOA gatherings. Extra chairs had been brought in, lining the walls and creating narrow pathways between impromptu rows. The air conditioning struggled against the heat generated by so many bodies in the confined space. Grandpa and I sat alone at a small table facing the elevated platform where the HOA board members presided. Ms. Donovan occupied the center seat, flanked by the 4 Oak Ridge representatives. To her right sat a stern-looking woman in a sharp business suit, introduced as Regina Mills, Director of Excellence Property Management. The patrol officer himself sat somewhat apart, his uniform immaculate, a small bandage ostentatiously displayed on his right hand. Ms. Donovan called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. The room fell silent. "We are convened tonight to address a serious violation of community standards, and more concerningly, an act of violence against an HOA official," she announced, her voice carrying the practiced gravity of someone accustomed to rendering judgment. "The board will hear testimony regarding dangerous modifications made to the property at 432 Maple Street, resulting in injury to our standards enforcement officer." Regina Mills rose first. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she approached a projection screen set up for the occasion. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is nothing short of a premeditated attack on community safety personnel." With theatrical precision, she clicked a remote. A photograph of our fence with its warning signs appeared on screen. The defendants deliberately installed an illegal electrical system designed to cause harm to anyone approaching their property. Another click showed a close-up of one warning sign. These so-called warnings do not mitigate the fact that booby-trapping one's property is both against HOA regulations and potentially criminal. The patrol officer was called next. He limped noticeably as he took the floor, though I had seen him walking normally just minutes before entering the building. "I was conducting a routine visual inspection," he began, voice quavering with practiced emotion, "when I noticed what appeared to be unauthorized modifications to the fence." He held up his bandaged hand. "Upon closer examination, I was violently electrocuted. The current was so severe that I was thrown several feet and temporarily lost consciousness." His voice broke slightly. "I have experienced recurring heart palpitations and nerve damage since the incident." Murmurs rippled through the audience. I glanced at Grandpa, concerned by these exaggerated claims, but his expression remained impassive, hands folded calmly on the table before him. When our turn came, Grandpa rose slowly, the USB drive clasped in his hand. He walked steadily to the computer connected to the projector. The room grew quiet, perhaps in deference to his age, or perhaps in anticipation of what defense we might offer against such serious accusations. Before I address the specific events of yesterday, Grandpa began, his voice clear and measured, I would like to establish some context. He inserted the USB drive and opened a video file. The screen showed our backyard, date stamped from 6 weeks earlier. The patrol officer appeared, looking around furtively before hoisting himself over our fence. Grandpa paused the video. This is the first documented instance of trespassing by the HOA enforcement officer. Note the date. He opened another file. The official violation notice received the next day, citing issues only visible from within our property. Then another video showing the officer walking through our garden. Then another, and another. Each clip was meticulously labeled with dates corresponding to violation notices we had received. As the evidence mounted, the atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Whispers grew louder. Ms. Donovan's face tightened. The patrol officer stared fixedly at the floor. Grandpa then produced a folder of documents. After documenting repeated unauthorized entry to our property, I researched our legal options. He displayed a notarized letter from a licensed electrician, certifying that our fence modification met all safety codes for low-voltage deterrent. Systems. Next came highlighted copies of state trespassing laws and property rights statutes. The system in question delivers approximately the same voltage as a standard livestock fence, uncomfortable but not harmful unless exposure is prolonged. Warning signs exceed the requirements mandated by safety codes. Grandpa's voice remained even professional. As for the officer's injuries, he clicked to the final video, yesterday's incident captured in high definition. The audience watched as the officer deliberately positioned himself to climb our fence despite clearly visible warnings, received a momentary shock, and fell into the mulch bed. The footage clearly showed him getting up immediately, checking himself for injuries, and finding none before his dramatic pointing gesture at the house. No loss of consciousness, no fall of several feet, and certainly no heart palpitations, Grandpa concluded quietly. Just a trespasser experiencing the natural consequence of ignoring posted warnings while attempting to illegally enter private property. The room erupted in conversation. Ms. Donovan banged her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. Beside her, Regina Mills whispered urgently to the Oak Ridge representatives, their expressions growing increasingly concerned. The atmosphere in the room had transformed completely. Where there had been suspicion directed at us, there was now open indignation toward the HOA leadership. Several neighbors stood up, asking to speak. Mrs. Winters, our next-door neighbor for 20 years, raised her hand first. I have received 17 violations in the past month, she said, voice quavering with emotion. That man, she pointed at the patrol officer, has been in my backyard at least 4 times without permission. I am a widow living alone. Do you understand how frightening that is? Mr. Peterson, the neighborhood complainer, surprisingly spoke next. They cited me for having wind chimes that exceeded noise regulations. To know this, someone had to be standing in my screened porch, because the chimes are not visible from the street. One by one, residents came forward with similar stories: invasive inspections, arbitrary violations, escalating fines. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Those who had refused to sell to Oak Ridge developers when they first came to the neighborhood were experiencing the most aggressive enforcement. Ms. Donovan's composure cracked as she struggled to regain control of the meeting. The Oak Ridge representatives huddled together, conferring in urgent whispers. Regina Mills sat rigidly in her chair, her earlier confidence evaporated. Finally, one of the Oak Ridge men, the eldest of the group, stood and cleared his throat. In light of this unexpected information, Oak Ridge Developers wishes to announce immediate changes to enforcement protocols. His voice carried the strained quality of someone performing damage control. Excellence Property Management's contract will be terminated, effective immediately. Regina Mills gasped audibly. The patrol officer slumped in his chair. Furthermore, the representative continued, all outstanding violations will be reviewed by an independent committee of residents. Fines that cannot be verified as legitimate will be refunded in full. The concessions continued. A restructuring of the HOA board to include more resident representatives, a review of all bylaws with community input, and a formal written apology to any homeowner who experienced inappropriate inspections. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors surrounded us, sharing their own stories and thanking Grandpa for standing up against the intimidation. Mrs. Garcia hugged me tightly. "Your grandfather is a true hero," she whispered. "We were all too scared to speak up." The following week brought significant changes. The formal letter of apology arrived, along with a check refunding all our previous fines. The patrol officer was reportedly fired after multiple homeowners submitted their own security footage of trespassing incidents. A community email announced that Excellence Property Management had been replaced with a local company that emphasized respectful enforcement and transparent communication. At the next neighborhood meeting, held in the community park pavilion rather than the sterile center, elections were held for new board positions. Not a single Oak Ridge representative remained in leadership. The revised HOA charter, drafted with extensive resident input, explicitly prohibited entering private property without written permission or a 24-hour notice. Life gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm. The electronic fence remained in place, though Grandpa rarely activated it now that the threat had passed. The warning sign stayed as well, a reminder of boundaries both physical and principal. One perfect summer evening, I found Grandpa sitting in his workshop doorway, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant orange and purple hues. A glass of lemonade rested beside him on the workbench. As I joined him, we noticed a woman walking along the sidewalk, the newly hired community liaison, keeping carefully to public spaces as she made her rounds. She waved respectfully as she passed. Grandpa returned the gesture with a satisfied smile. "You know what the most important thing is about electrical engineering?" he asked after a comfortable silence. "What is that?" "Understanding that every circuit needs proper boundaries to function correctly." He sipped his ale.